The scorching sun beat down on Galilee Turner's sweat-soaked blouse as the four men circled her wagon like vultures over dying prey, their eyes gleaming with malice and something far worse. "Looks like we found ourselves a pretty little traveler, boys," the tallest one said, running his tongue over yellowed teeth. "And she's got herself a mighty fine wagon of supplies." Galilee stood her ground despite the trembling in her knees. The journey from Boston to Arizona Territory had hardened her in ways she never expected. Her father's death 3 weeks into their journey west had left her alone, but she'd promised him she'd reach Tucson and claim the land he'd purchased sight unseen. Now, barely 2 days from her destination, these men threatened everything. "I suggest you gentlemen move along," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Her hand inched toward the small derringer hidden in the folds of her skirt. One shot, that's all she had, and 4 men to contend with. The men laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine despite the 100-degree heat. "Hear that, boys? The lady wants us to move along." The apparent leader stepped closer. "Thing is, madam, traveling alone in these parts ain't safe. Might be we need to escort you, for a price, of course." "I don't need an escort," Galilee replied, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of her hidden gun. The second man, shorter but broader than the first, reached for her arm. "Don't be like that, darlin'. We're just being neighborly." That's when she heard it, the thundering of hooves approaching fast from the east. The men heard it too, their heads snapping toward the sound. A lone rider appeared through the heat-warped air, tall in the saddle of a powerful buckskin stallion. He rode hard, dust billowing behind him like a storm cloud. As he drew closer, Galilee could make out the wide-brimmed hat, the worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and most importantly, the rifle held confidently across his lap. The men surrounding her shifted nervously. The newcomer reined his horse to a stop about 20 yards away, assessing the situation with cool blue eyes. "Afternoon," he called, his voice deep and measured. "Seems like the lady might be having some trouble." "Ain't no trouble here," the leader snarled. "Just having a friendly conversation with the lady. None of your concern, mister." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, rifle still in hand but pointed casually at the ground. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. A few days' growth of beard shadowed his jaw, and a thin scar ran along his left cheekbone. "Madam," he asked, looking directly at Galilee, "these men bothering you?" Before she could answer, the leader stepped between them. "I said this ain't your business. There's 4 of us and 1 of you." "Those ain't good odds, friend." The stranger's expression didn't change. "I've had worse." "Look here," the leader began, his hand drifting toward his holster. The stranger moved so quickly Galilee barely saw it, the rifle barrel now pointed squarely at the leader's chest. "I wouldn't." The tension stretched between them like a wire about to snap. Galilee decided to seize the moment. "I don't owe you anything," she said firmly, stepping away from the men and closer to her wagon. "Any of you, so I suggest you leave now." The leader's face flushed with anger. "You uppity little, I'd think hard about your next words," the stranger interrupted. "And your next move." A standoff hung in the air for several heartbeats, then the leader spat on the ground. "Come on, boys, ain't worth getting shot over some stuck-up woman and her trinkets." He glared at the stranger. "You watch yourself, cowboy, these parts ain't friendly to heroes." The 4 men mounted their horses, casting dark glances over their shoulders as they rode away. Galilee didn't relax until they were specks on the horizon. Only then did she turn to her unexpected savior. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with eyes the color of a summer sky. Those eyes were studying her now with a mix of concern and something else she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said, smoothing her skirt with hands that still trembled slightly. "I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't come along." He nodded, finally lowering his rifle completely. "Mason Reed," he said by way of introduction. "Where you headed, madam, if you don't mind my asking? Not many women travel these parts alone." "Galilee Turner, I'm bound for Tucson." She hesitated, then added, "I wasn't always alone. My father, he didn't survive the journey." Something softened in Mason's face. "I'm sorry to hear that, Miss Turner." "Mrs." she corrected automatically, then felt a pang as she always did when she remembered. Well, I was Mrs. Turner. My husband died of fever 2 years ago back east. Mason removed his hat, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. Seems you've had more than your share of sorrow, madam. Galilee squared her shoulders. Life happens as it will, Mr. Reed. I'm still here. A small smile tugged at his lips. That you are. He glanced at her wagon. Tucson's still a good 2 days' ride, and those men might circle back once they've nursed their pride a bit. If you've no objection, I'd be happy to ride along with you. I'm headed that way myself. Caution warred with practicality in Galilee's mind. She'd learned the hard way that men's offers of help often came with expectations, yet the threat of those four returning was very real. Why would you do that, Mr. Reed? You don't know me. Mason replaced his hat, adjusting it against the sun. Let's just say I've seen what happens to folks who travel alone in these territories. Besides, he added with a hint of that smile again, my mother would haunt me from her grave if I left a lady to fend for herself against the likes of those coyotes. Despite everything, Galilee found herself returning his smile. Well, I wouldn't want to be responsible for you being haunted, Mr. Reed. Mason, he corrected. If we're traveling together, might as well use first names. Very well, Mason. The name felt strange on her tongue. I accept your offer, but I should warn you I'm not some helpless female who needs constant looking after. His eyes traveled to where her hand had been hovering near her hidden derringer earlier. I noticed. Got yourself a pocket pistol, I expect. Galilee felt heat rise to her cheeks. A lady needs protection. Indeed she does. Though that little gun might sting one of those fellows, it wouldn't stop all four. It would have stopped one, she replied evenly. The rest would have been up to Providence. Mason studied her for a long moment, then laughed a genuine sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Mrs. Turner, I believe Providence has the right idea about you. Shall we get moving? There's a decent spot to camp about 5 miles ahead, near a creek with clean water. As they set off, Galilee couldn't help wondering if she'd made the right decision. Mason Reed seemed honorable enough, but the West had taught her that appearances could be deceiving. Still, as she watched him ride slightly ahead, scanning the horizon with alert eyes, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long while, a sense of security. The land stretched around them, vast and unforgiving, painted in shades of red and gold as the afternoon sun began its descent. Whatever Providence had in store, Galilee decided, at least she wouldn't face it alone tonight. Mason kept a respectful distance as they traveled, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of information about the territory. He had an easy way about him that gradually put Galilee at ease, though she remained vigilant. Years of loss had taught her the value of caution. When they reached the promised creek, the sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Mason helped her unhitch the horses from her wagon, his movements efficient and practiced. Been traveling long? Galilee asked as they worked. Mason nodded. Most of my life, seems like. Drove cattle up from Texas, scouted for the army for a spell, did some work at the silver mines near Tombstone. A man of many talents, she observed. Jack of all trades, master of none, he replied with a self-deprecating smile. What takes you to Tucson? Family waiting, Galilee shook her head. My father purchased land there. He had visions of starting a new life away from Boston. When he passed, I decided to honor his wishes. Mason raised an eyebrow. Farming? A ranch, actually. Though I admit I know more about proper tea service than cattle. He chuckled at that. Well, ranching's hard work, but good work. Honest, do you know where exactly this land is? Near a place called Silver Springs. Father said it has year-round water and good grazing land. Mason's expression changed so subtly Galilee almost missed it, a slight tightening around the eyes, a momentary stillness. You know it, she asked. I've passed through, he said after a pause. It's good land. Something in his tone made Galilee curious, but she didn't press. Everyone in the West seemed to have stories they preferred not to tell. She certainly had her own. As darkness fell, Mason built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans, dried beef, and coffee that tasted better than anything Galilee had managed to cook during her journey. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the desert rising around them. Where did you learn to shoot? Mason asked suddenly. Galilee looked up, surprised. My husband taught me. James believed a woman should know how to defend herself. She smiled at the memory. He was progressive in many ways. Sounds like a good man. He was. Galilee stared into the fire. We were to come west together. He talked about it constantly: wide open spaces, fresh air, opportunity. After he died, I couldn't bear to stay in Boston. Everything reminded me of him, of our plans. Mason nodded slowly. The West has a way of offering new beginnings. And you, Mason. What beginning are you seeking? His eyes met hers across the fire, and for a moment, Galilee glimpsed something raw and unguarded in them. Maybe I'm just running from endings, he said quietly. The vulnerability in his voice stirred something in Galilee. Recognition, perhaps. She knew what it meant to flee from grief, to seek solace in motion and distance. The moment passed as Mason stood to add wood to the fire. You should get some rest, Mrs. Turner. I'll keep watch for a while. Galilee, she said. If we're using first names. He nodded, a small smile returning. Galilee, like the sea. My mother was devout, said I was as unpredictable as those biblical waters. Mason's smile widened. Was she right? Galilee found herself returning his smile. Perhaps you'll find out, Mr. Reed. She retreated to her wagon for the night, arranging her bedroll and listening to Mason moving around the campsite. Despite her lingering caution, she slept better than she had in weeks, lulled by the knowledge that someone was standing guard. Morning came with golden light and birdsong. Galilee emerged from her wagon to find coffee already brewing and Mason returning from the creek, his hair damp and his face freshly shaved. Something fluttered in her chest at the sight of him, a sensation she quickly suppressed. Sleep well? He asked, pouring her a cup of coffee. Better than I expected, she admitted, accepting the tin cup. Thank you. They broke camp efficiently and continued their journey, the landscape gradually changing as they traveled. The sparse desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and palo verde trees. By midday, they could see mountains in the distance, their peaks hazy in the heat. We'll reach Tucson by tomorrow afternoon, Mason said as they stopped to rest the horses. From there, Silver Springs is another half-day's ride east. Galilee nodded, suddenly feeling anxious about reaching her destination. What if her father's land wasn't what he'd believed it to be? What if she couldn't manage it alone? The doubts she'd pushed aside during the long journey now rushed forward. Having second thoughts, Mason asked perceptively. Galilee straightened her shoulders. Not at all, just considering the challenges ahead. Ranching isn't easy, he acknowledged. But neither is crossing half the country alone after burying your father. You've got grit, Galilee Turner. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. I'm simply doing what needs to be done. That's what grit is, Mason replied. Doing what needs doing, even when it's hard. They continued on, talking easily about everything and nothing: the weather, the wildlife, stories of the territory. Mason knew the land intimately, pointing out plants with medicinal properties and signs of water that Galilee would have missed. He had a teacher's patience and never made her feel foolish for asking questions. By evening, they made camp in a small valley sheltered by rocky outcroppings. The night was cooler here, and Galilee was grateful for the fire Mason built. As they shared another simple meal, she found herself studying him when he wasn't looking: the way firelight played across his features, the careful precision of his movements, the quiet strength he carried without bravado. You never said what brings you to Tucson, she remarked. Mason hesitated, poking at the fire with a stick. Business. What kind of business? The unfinished kind. When she raised an eyebrow, he added, Nothing illegal if that's your concern. It wasn't. No. He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Most folks out here are cautious about strangers, and rightfully so. I'm cautious, Galilee admitted, but I'm also a fair judge of character. You don't strike me as an outlaw, Mason Reed. A shadow passed across his face. I've made my share of mistakes. Haven't we all? The question hung between them, intimate somehow. Mason set aside his plate and leaned back against his saddle. Tell me about Boston, he said, changing the subject. I've never been east of the Mississippi. Galilee obliged, describing the cobblestone streets, the harbor filled with ships, the proper society that had both nurtured and suffocated her. As she spoke, she realized how distant that life now seemed, like something she'd read about rather than lived. It sounds very civilized, Mason said when she finished. It was, too civilized perhaps, everything prescribed, everyone watching. After James died, the sympathy was suffocating. People had already decided what my life should be: the grieving widow who eventually remarries a suitable man, probably one of James's business associates. And that wasn't what you wanted. Galilee stared into the fire. I couldn't bear the thought. Not when James and I had dreamed of something so different. Coming west was a way to honor him, but also to escape all those expectations. To find your own way, Mason said softly. Yes, she looked up at him. Is that why you came west, to find your own way? Something unreadable flickered in his eyes. Something like that. Silence fell between them, but it was comfortable rather than awkward. The night sounds enveloped them: crickets chirping, the occasional call of a night bird, the soft nickering of the horses. I'll take first watch again, Mason offered eventually. I can take a turn, Galilee insisted. I'm not helpless, remember? Mason's mouth quirked. I remember. Wake me in 4 hours then. Galilee nodded, settling back against her own bedroll as Mason moved to a position where he could survey their surroundings. She watched him for a while, this enigmatic man who had appeared just when she needed help. There was more to his story, she was certain, but then there was more to everyone's story out here. The night passed without incident. Galilee took her turn at watch, finding an unexpected peace in the quiet darkness and the canopy of stars overhead. When morning came, they set off again, both aware that their journey together was nearing its end. By mid-afternoon, they crested a hill and saw Tucson spread before them in the valley below, a collection of adobe buildings, wooden structures, and tents sprawling along the Santa Cruz River. After weeks of wilderness, the sight of civilization, however rough, made Galilee's heart quicken. It's bigger than I expected, she remarked. Growing every day, Mason replied. Silver strikes, the railroad coming through, the military presence, it's drawing all kinds. They approached the town, joining other travelers on the dusty main road. Galilee was acutely aware of the glances they received. A woman and a man traveling together always drew attention in these parts. Mason guided them to a small hotel on the edge of town. You can get a decent room here, he said. The owner's wife keeps it clean, and they have a secure stable for your wagon and horses. And you? Galilee asked, surprising herself with how much she cared about his answer. Mason's expression was carefully neutral. I have some matters to attend to in town, but I promise to see you to Silver Springs, and I will if you still want my company. I do, she said, perhaps too quickly. That is, I would appreciate your guidance. As you said, I'm new to ranching. Something that might have been disappointment flickered across his face, but he nodded. I'll come by tomorrow morning then. 8 o'clock. That would be fine. He helped her secure accommodations and saw to her wagon and horses before taking his leave. Galilee watched him ride away down the dusty street, a curious emptiness settling in her chest. After 2 days in his company, being alone again felt strangely disorienting. The hotel room was simple but clean, as promised. Galilee took advantage of the luxury of a proper bath. Washing away the dust of travel and changing into one of the few dresses she'd kept unpacked during the journey. Looking in the spotted mirror, she hardly recognized herself, her skin tanned by the sun, her auburn hair less vibrantly red, her green eyes somehow older and more knowing than they'd been in Boston. She ventured downstairs to the small dining room where the hotel owner's wife served a surprisingly tasty stew with fresh bread. Several men at nearby tables cast interested glances her way, but Galilee kept to herself, her thoughts occupied with what tomorrow might bring. And if she was honest, with Mason read his quiet competence, his respectful manner, the mystery that seemed to surround him. There was something compelling about him that went beyond his undeniable good looks. Something that made her wonder what it would be like to know him better, in a different context. Galilee shook away such thoughts. She was here for a purpose: to claim her father's land and build the life he'd envisioned. Romance had no place in those plans, not when she'd already loved and lost once. Besides, Mason clearly had his own agenda in Tucson, one that didn't include escorting a widow to her new ranch indefinitely. After dinner, she retired early, fatigue catching up with her now that she'd reached relative safety. But sleep proved elusive. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the town piano music from a nearby saloon, occasional bursts of laughter, the clip-clop of horses passing by. She wondered where Mason was now, what business had brought him to Tucson. The question followed her into restless dreams where she chased a figure who always remained just out of reach, his features shifting between those of her father, her late husband, and Mason Reed. Morning came with a knock at her door precisely at 8 o'clock. Galilee, already dressed and ready, opened it to find Mason standing there, hat in hand. He'd changed his clothes, the faded blue shirt replaced by a clean white one, his leather vest polished, his dark trousers showing crisp creases. "Good morning," he said, and Galilee noticed his eyes widen slightly as they took in her appearance. She'd chosen her most practical dress for the day, a navy blue cotton with minimal trim, but had taken care with her hair, arranging it in a neat chignon at the nape of her neck. "Good morning," she replied, suddenly feeling shy. "You look refreshed." A smile touched his lips. "As do you. Are you ready to see your land?" The question sent a flutter of nervousness through her. "Yes, I believe I am." They collected her wagon and horses from the stable and set off eastward out of town. The day was clear and bright, the spring air carrying the scent of desert flowers and sage. As they left Tucson behind, Mason became more talkative, pointing out landmarks and sharing information about the area's history. "The Apaches considered this sacred land," he explained as they passed a distinctive rock formation. "Chief Cochise used to camp in these hills before the troubles started. You know a great deal about the territory," Galilee observed. Mason's expression grew distant. "I was a scout for the army for 3 years, learned the land, learned about the people who have been here long before us." "You don't sound like you approved of the Army's methods." His jaw tightened slightly. "Let's just say there's been wrong done on all sides. The Apaches are proud people defending their homeland, our government." He shook his head. "Politics and greed make for poor decisions." They continued eastward, the terrain becoming more varied, rocky outcroppings giving way to stretches of grassland dotted with oak and juniper trees. After several hours of travel, Mason guided them toward a rise in the land. "Just over this hill," he said, his voice taking on an odd tone Galilee couldn't quite interpret. They crested the hill, and the vista spread before them took Galilee's breath away. A broad valley stretched for miles, bisected by a clear stream that meandered through stands of cottonwood trees. Grass grew thick and green along the watercourse, while cattle several dozen head grazed peacefully in the distance. Against the far side of the valley, nestled at the base of a small mountain, stood a ranch house and several outbuildings. "Silver Springs," Mason said quietly. Galilee stared in wonder. "It's beautiful, more beautiful than I imagined. Your father chose well. This is some of the best grazing land in the territory, and that creek runs year-round, fed by mountain springs." As they descended into the valley, Galilee noticed Mason's demeanor changing, becoming more alert, almost tense. His eyes scanned the ranch buildings ahead with an intensity that made her uneasy. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Mason seemed to catch himself. "No, just being cautious. Best to approach any property with care out here." They continued toward the ranch house, which grew more impressive as they neared. It was larger than Galilee had expected, a substantial adobe structure with a wide porch and several windows. The outbuildings included a barn, what appeared to be a bunkhouse, and various corrals and pens. Everything looked well maintained, which puzzled her. "I expected it to be more abandoned," she admitted. "Father purchased this land over a year ago, but never had a chance to develop it." Mason's expression was unreadable. "Looks like someone's been taking care of it." As if on cue, a figure emerged from the barn, a tall man with graying hair and a weathered face. He stopped when he spotted them, then raised a hand in greeting and started walking toward them. "That's Benjamin Walker," Mason said, surprising Galilee. "The foreman. You know him." Before Mason could answer, the man called out, "Mason Reed, didn't expect to see you back so soon." His eyes shifted to Galilee. "And you must be Jonathan Turner's daughter. We've been expecting you." Galilee looked between the two men in confusion. "You've been expecting me? How, and how do you two know each other?" Benjamin Walker reached them, extending a hand to help Galilee down from the wagon. "Mason here is the one who sold this ranch to your father last year, didn't he tell you?" The revelation hit Galilee like a physical blow. She turned to Mason, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. "No," she said coldly. "He failed to mention that particular detail." Mason dismounted, his expression carefully neutral. "I was planning to explain everything once you'd seen the property." Benjamin looked between them, sensing the tension. "Well, I'll just go let Mrs. Walker know we have company. She'll want to prepare something for lunch." He tipped his hat to Galilee. "Madam, welcome to Silver Springs. Your father hired me and my wife to maintain the place until he arrived. We were mighty sorry to hear of his passing." As Benjamin walked away, Galilee turned to Mason, anger rising in her chest. "You owned this ranch. You knew exactly who I was from the moment we met, didn't you?" Mason met her gaze steadily. "Yes. Were those men who accosted me part of your plan too, a convenient way to ingratiate yourself?" His expression hardened. "I had nothing to do with those men. Finding you surrounded by them was genuine chance or providence, if you prefer." "Why the deception?" "Why not simply tell me who you were?" Mason sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Would you have trusted me if I'd approached you and said, 'Hello, I'm the man who sold your father land he never saw'? I might have, had you been honest. Instead, you've been playing some game, letting me believe we met by coincidence." "It was coincidence," he insisted. "I was headed to Tucson on other business entirely when I came across you and those men. I recognized your name when you introduced yourself, yes, but by then, helping you seemed like the right thing to do regardless." Galilee crossed her arms. "And your business in Tucson, was that a lie too?" "No. I had matters to settle with the bank and the land office finalizing the sale to your father. His lawyer sent word of his passing and your intention to claim the property. So you've known everything about me and my situation, while I've known almost nothing true about you." The betrayal stung more than it should have, given how briefly she'd known him. Mason stepped closer, his eyes earnest. "Not everything I told you was a lie, Galilee. Yes, I omitted certain facts, but my reasons— I'm not interested in your reasons, Mr. Reed." She cut him off coldly. "You've delivered me to my property as promised. Our business is concluded." A flash of hurt crossed his face before he masked it. "As you wish, Mrs. Turner, but there are things about this ranch you should know. I'm sure Mr. Walker can tell me anything I need to know," she interrupted. "Good day to you." Mason stood still for a moment, as if weighing whether to say more. Finally, he nodded, replaced his hat, and mounted his horse. "The Walkers are good people," he said quietly. "They'll help you get settled if you need anything." He paused, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "My property adjoins yours to the north. This is a map showing the boundaries and water rights." Galilee took the paper without looking at it. "You still own land nearby, a small parcel. Just enough for a cabin and a few horses." His eyes met hers one last time, and something in them made her breath catch. "Goodbye, Galilee Turner." She watched him ride away, conflicting emotions churning inside her. Anger at his deception warred with an inexplicable sense of loss. Only when he disappeared over the rise did she turn toward the ranch house, her ranch house, where Benjamin Walker and a plump, pleasant-looking woman were waiting on the porch. "Mrs. Turner," the woman called, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Margaret Walker. Come inside out of this sun. You must be exhausted from your journey." Galilee gathered herself and moved forward, determined to focus on the task at hand, learning about her new home and responsibilities. The mystery of Mason Reed and his motives would have to wait. The Walkers proved to be a godsend. Over the next few days, they introduced Galilee to every aspect of the ranch operations. Benjamin showed her the property boundaries, explained the cattle breeding program, and introduced her to the 3 cowboys who worked the herd. Margaret taught her about the vegetable garden behind the house, the chicken coop that provided fresh eggs, and the basics of managing a household in the territories. The ranch house itself was a pleasant surprise, solidly built, with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a comfortable sitting room. Previous owners had furnished it simply but adequately, and Galilee's belongings from the wagon added personal touches. "Mason built most of this furniture himself," Margaret mentioned casually as they arranged Galilee's books on a handsome oak shelf. He's got quite a talent for woodworking. Galilee's hands stilled. Did he own this ranch long? Margaret folded a tablecloth, avoiding Galilee's eyes. About 5 years, built it up from nearly nothing. Everyone was surprised when he decided to sell. Why did he? Galilee couldn't help asking. Margaret hesitated. That's really his story to tell, madam. Galilee nodded, respecting the woman's loyalty while feeling increasingly frustrated by the mystery surrounding Mason Reed. The man had deceived her, yet she couldn't stop thinking about him, his quiet competence, his unexpected kindness, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. It was maddening. A week passed, then two. Galilee threw herself into learning ranching, determined to make her father's investment a success. The work was physically demanding but oddly satisfying. Each day brought new challenges and small victories. The first time she successfully helped deliver a calf, learning to identify which cattle needed attention, mastering the art of bread making in the temperamental wood stove. The walkers proved invaluable, patient with her mistakes and generous with their knowledge. Benjamin taught her to ride properly, not side saddle as she'd learned in Boston, but astride, which scandalized and liberated her in equal measure. Margaret showed her how to preserve food for the coming winter and introduced her to neighboring ranch wives who welcomed her with practical gifts and advice. Through it all, Galilee found herself watching the northern property line, half expecting to see Mason appear. But he never did, and she refused to ask about him, though she caught the walkers exchanging knowing glances when certain topics arose. On a warm afternoon about a month after her arrival, Galilee was returning from checking the eastern pasture when she spotted riders approaching 3 men she didn't recognize. Benjamin was in town for supplies, and the ranch hands were working the far pastures. Margaret was alone at the house. Concern prickling her spine, Galilee urged her horse forward, intercepting the riders before they reached the main buildings. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she called, keeping her voice steady while her hand drifted to the rifle in her saddle scabbard, a weapon Benjamin had insisted she learn to use. The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a florid face, reined his horse to a stop, looking for Mason Reed. His eyes assessed her with insulting thoroughness. "You his new woman," Galilee straightened in her saddle. "This is the Turner Ranch. Mr. Reed's property is further north." The man spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Turner, heard Reed sold to some Easterner. That you?" "I'm Galilee Turner, yes, and you are?" He ignored her question. "Where's Reed?" "As I said, his property is to the north. I haven't seen him in weeks." The man exchanged glances with his companions. "Convenient. Tell you what, Mrs. Turner, when you do see him, tell him Silas Hardin wants a word about those water rights he promised." Something about the name niggled at Galilee's memory. "Mr. Hardin, I believe any disputes over water rights should be addressed through proper legal channels." Hardin laughed, an ugly sound. "Hear that, boys? The lady believes in proper legal channels. Ain't that sweet?" His expression hardened. "This ain't Boston, madam. Out here, a man's word is his bond, and Reed gave his word. Then he sold to you instead of me," understanding dawned. "You wanted to buy this ranch. Had a handshake agreement. Then suddenly Reed selling to some stranger from back east for twice what we discussed." Hardin leaned forward in his saddle. "That water creek running through your property feeds my southern grazing lands. Reed promised access." Galilee remembered the map Mason had given her, still unexamined in her desk drawer. "I know nothing about any agreement, Mr. Hardin. But I'm willing to discuss reasonable access to the water, provided don't need your permission for what's rightfully mine," Hardin interrupted. "Reed knows the score. You tell him I came by, and next time I won't be so neighborly." With that, the 3 men wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving Galilee unsettled and confused. She returned to the house to find Margaret watching anxiously from the porch. "Was that Silas Hardin?" the older woman asked, wringing her hands in her apron. "Yes, do you know him?" Margaret nodded grimly. "Owns the big spread to the south, been trying to buy up all the land around here for years, not a man to cross. He seemed to think he had some agreement with Mason about water rights." "Hardin thinks a lot of things," Margaret said cryptically. "Come inside. I'll make us some tea." In the kitchen, as Margaret bustled about with the kettle, Galilee pressed for more information. What exactly happened between Mason and Hardin? Margaret sighed, setting cups on the table. Hardin's been after this land since before Mason bought it. Made all sorts of offers, then threats when Mason wouldn't sell. About a year ago, things got nasty. Hardin's men started cutting fences, harassing the hands, running off cattle. Why didn't Mason report it to the authorities? He did. But the sheriff's Hardin's second cousin, and the territorial judge only comes through every few months. Margaret poured the tea. Then Mason met your father in Tucson. Mr. Turner was looking for good ranch land, willing to pay fair price. Mason saw a way out sell to your father, who had Eastern connections and money for proper legal representation. And Hardin wasn't happy about that. That's putting it mildly. There was an incident. After that, Mason decided to keep just a small piece of land for himself and move on. What kind of incident? Galilee asked, suspicion growing. Margaret looked uncomfortable. That's really for Mason to explain. Frustration bubbled up inside Galilee. Everyone keeps saying that, but the man himself is nowhere to be found. I'm trying to understand what I've walked into here. The older woman reached across the table to pat Galilee's hand. I know it's confusing, dear, but Mason had his reasons for everything he did. Good reasons. Galilee withdrew her hand. Good reasons for deceiving me, for letting me believe our meeting was coincidence. He found you in trouble and helped you, didn't he? Would you have trusted him if he'd told you everything right away? I'll never know, will I, because he chose not to give me that chance. Margaret studied her face. You care for him. The observation startled Galilee. I barely know him. And yet you're hurt by his deception. That suggests some feeling. Galilee couldn't deny it, though she wanted to. Something about Mason Reed had affected her from their first meeting, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the shadows in his eyes that spoke of pain she recognized. But any possibility of exploring those feelings had been destroyed by his dishonesty. It doesn't matter, she said finally. What matters now is understanding the situation with Hardin and protecting this ranch, my ranch. Margaret nodded slowly. Benjamin will be back from town soon. He'll want to know about Hardin's visit. That evening, when Benjamin returned, his reaction to Hardin's appearance was grim. Man's trouble, he said as they sat at the kitchen table. Always has been. His ranch is overgrazed and he's desperate for access to your water. Mason gave me a map showing the property boundaries and water rights, Galilee mentioned. I haven't looked at it yet. Benjamin's eyebrows rose. Might be a good time to do that. Galilee retrieved the folded paper from her desk. Opening it revealed a detailed hand-drawn map of Silver Springs Ranch and the surrounding properties. Mason's precise script labeled various features: the creek, springs, grazing areas, neighboring boundaries. Along the bottom was a note: water rights legally secured with Territorial Land Office. Deed filed in Tucson Courthouse. Hardin has no legal claim to access despite his assertions. Be careful, Mr. He knew Hardin would approach me, Galilee realized. Benjamin nodded. Mason's nobody's fool. He'd have anticipated Hardin making trouble eventually. What do we do? Keep vigilant. I'll have the boys ride the boundaries more regularly, especially near Hardin's property line. Might be good to visit the land office in Tucson yourself, make sure all the paperwork's in order. Galilee agreed, but as she prepared for bed that night, worry gnawed at her. She'd come west seeking a fresh start, not a range war with a resentful neighbor. And beneath that practical concern lay another, more personal one: where was Mason Reed, and why had he stayed away? The answer came 3 days later, as Galilee returned from Tucson, where she'd verified her water rights with the land office. Approaching the ranch, she spotted a familiar figure on horseback near the northern boundary, tall and straight in the saddle, unmistakable even at a distance. Her heart raced as she urged her horse forward. Mason saw her coming and waited, his expression guarded as she drew near. Mrs. Turner, he greeted her formally, removing his hat. Mr. Reed. Galilee studied him, noting new lines of fatigue around his eyes. You've been scarce. Thought it best to give you space. Benjamin mentioned Hardin paid a visit. Yes, she met his gaze directly. You might have warned me about him. Mason sighed. I planned to that day when you arrived, before you dismissed me. The reminder of her anger stung, but Galilee acknowledged its fairness with a nod. The map you gave me was helpful. I've confirmed the water rights with the land office. Good. Hardin respects legal documentation even if he pretends otherwise. Mason replaced his hat. How are you finding ranch life? The mundane question after weeks of silence nearly made Galilee laugh. Challenging, exhausting, surprisingly rewarding. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. The walkers taking good care of you, they've been invaluable. Galilee hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning inside her. Why did you really sell the ranch, Mason? Margaret mentioned an incident with Hardin. Mason's expression darkened. Did she now? She wouldn't provide details. Said it was your story to tell. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. Hardin's men shot my brother, he said finally. Claimed they mistook him for a rustler in the dark. Thomas died 3 days later. Galilee's hand flew to her mouth. Mason, I'm so sorry. It happened right here, about 100 yards from where we're sitting. Thomas was checking the north fence line. Hardin's men had cut it twice that week. His voice was controlled, but tension radiated from every line of his body. No witnesses except me, and I only saw the aftermath. Sheriff Hardin's cousin called it a tragic accident. That's why you sold to my father, to get away from the memories. Mason met her eyes. Partly. And partly because I knew if I stayed, I'd eventually kill Hardin or he'd kill me. Neither outcome seemed worth it after Thomas died. He took a deep breath. Your father offered a fair price and had the resources to stand up to Hardin legally. It seemed like providence. The pieces were finally falling into place, and when you found me on the road, I recognized your name, yes. Knew you were Jonathan Turner's daughter coming to claim the ranch. I'd planned to introduce myself properly in Tucson, explain everything, but those men changed the timing. Why not tell me immediately who you were? Mason's eyes softened. At first, it didn't seem relevant to the immediate situation. Later, I don't know, you were so determined, so independent, I admired that. I didn't want you to think I was interfering or had some claim on the property. So instead, you let me believe in a coincidence that wasn't coincidence at all. A mistake, he acknowledged, for which I apologize. Galilee considered his words, the sincerity in his eyes. The anger she'd nursed these past weeks felt suddenly hollow in the face of his loss and his explanation. I believe you, she said finally, but I wish you'd trusted me with the truth from the beginning. As do I. He shifted in his saddle. How much trouble has Hardin given you? Just the one visit so far. Benjamin's increased patrols along the southern boundary. Mason nodded. Hardin's not a man to give up easily. Be watchful. I will. Galilee hesitated, then added, the walkers mentioned you kept some land to the north, just enough for a cabin and a few horses, nothing fancy. Yet I haven't seen you around. A faint smile touched his lips. Been keeping my distance, as requested. Besides, I've been in Tucson most days, working. Doing what? The sheriff retired. Judge Patterson appointed me interim sheriff until elections in the fall. Galilee's eyes widened. You're the new sheriff, seems so. Hardin's not happy about it, which is reason enough to take the job. Mason glanced at the son's position. I should get back to town. Just wanted to check the boundary markers after the rain last week. Of course, Galilee said, feeling strangely reluctant to end their conversation. Thank you for explaining everything. Mason studied her face for a moment. You're doing well here, Galilee. Your father would be proud. The simple words, spoken with evident sincerity, touched her deeply. Thank you, Mason. He tipped his hat and turned his horse. Be careful. Send word to town if Hardin causes any trouble. As she watched him ride away, Galilee felt something shift inside her, anger giving way to understanding, and perhaps something warmer. Mason Reed was a more complicated man than she'd initially believed, shaped by loss and principle rather than deception. The realization left her with much to consider as she returned to the ranch house. Over the next several weeks, life settled into a rhythm. Galilee continued learning the ranch operations, growing more confident daily. Spring brought calving season, keeping everyone busy from dawn to dusk. The work left little time for reflection, though thoughts of Mason Reed still surfaced in quiet moments. She saw him occasionally, brief encounters in Tucson when she went for supplies. A distant figure riding the property line. Once at Sunday services in the small church where he nodded politely but kept his distance. He was respected in his new role as sheriff, she learned from overheard conversations. Firm but fair, people said. Not a man to be trifled with. Hardin remained a concern hovering at the edges of her awareness. Twice more his men approached the southern boundary, claiming to be chasing strays, though Benjamin suspected they were testing the ranch's vigilance. Galilee documented each incident carefully, on Mason's written advice delivered through Benjamin. Summer arrived with blazing heat and afternoon thunderstorms. The creek running through Silver Springs remained strong, while word came that Hardin's southern water sources were drying up. Tension simmered like the heat waves rising from the desert floor. One evening in late July, Galilee was alone in the house, the Walkers having gone to visit their daughter in Tucson for 2 days, when she heard horses approaching. Looking out the window, her stomach tightened at the sight of Silas Hardin and 5 riders. Unlike his previous visit, this time they rode directly to the house, their manner purposeful and threatening. Galilee retrieved her rifle from beside the door, checking that it was loaded before stepping onto the porch. The evening sun cast long shadows across the yard as the men dismounted. "Mr. Hardin," she called, keeping the rifle visible but pointed downward. "What brings you here at this hour?" Hardin's eyes fixed on the weapon, then rose to her face with a smirk. "Now, Mrs. Turner, is that any way to greet neighbors? Neighbors generally send word before calling." "Especially at supper time," one of the men chuckled, earning a glare from Hardin. "We won't take much of your time, madam. Just come to discuss our water situation again." "There's nothing to discuss. The creek on my property is legally mine, as the Territorial Land Office has confirmed." Hardin climbed the porch steps, ignoring the way Galilee tightened her grip on the rifle. "Legal papers are one thing, madam. Practicalities are another. My cattle are dying of thirst. All I'm asking is access to water that's flowing uselessly through your property. That water sustains my herd and irrigates my fields. It's hardly flowing uselessly. You've got more than you need, and I've got none. Seems to me there's room for neighborly accommodation." His tone remained civil, but something dangerous lurked beneath the surface. "I might have considered a limited arrangement if you'd approached me properly, Mr. Hardin. Instead, you've cut my fences, harassed my hands, and now you arrive unannounced with what appears to be an armed escort." Hardin's expression hardened. "You've been talking to Reed." "I've been observing facts. Now I'll thank you to leave my property." He took another step closer. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Turner. A woman alone out here needs friends, not enemies." "I'm not alone, Mr. Hardin. I have loyal hands and good neighbors." Galilee raised the rifle slightly. "And I know how to use this." For a tense moment, Hardin stared at her, calculation in his eyes, then he laughed abruptly. "Spunky little thing, ain't you? Reed sure knows how to pick 'em." "What does that mean?" "Means he didn't sell to you by accident, lady. He picked you special, figured a widow woman from back east would be easy to manipulate. Probably planning to sweet-talk his way back into ownership once you realized how hard ranching really is." The accusation stung, partly because Galilee had harbored similar suspicions initially. "You don't know what you're talking about." "No, ask yourself why he kept land right next to yours instead of making a clean break. Ask why he took the sheriff's job suddenly. Man's playing a long game. You need to leave now." Hardin shrugged, stepping back. "Have it your way. But remember, offer of neighborly accommodation won't last forever. Way I see it, that creek's going to feed my cattle one way or another." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hardin?" "Just stating facts, madam. Good evening to you." The men mounted and rode away, leaving Galilee shaken but resolute. Once they were out of sight, she went inside and wrote a quick note, then saddled her horse and rode to the bunkhouse where the ranch hands were finishing their supper. She gave the note to young Billy Jenkins, the fastest rider among them. "Take this to Sheriff Reed in Tucson," she instructed. "Wait for his reply." Billy nodded, clearly sensing the urgency in her tone, and was on his horse and gone within minutes. Galilee returned to the house, checked all the doors and windows, and settled in for a vigilant night, the rifle close at hand. She didn't expect a response until morning, so the sound of hoofbeats approaching near midnight startled her. Peering cautiously through the window, she felt a rush of relief at the sight of Mason dismounting, his badge catching the moonlight. She opened the door before he could knock. "You came yourself," she said, unnecessary but the only words that came to mind. Mason removed his hat as he entered. Your note said Hardin threatened you. Of course I came myself. In the lamplight, she could see the concern etched on his face, the tension in his shoulders. He'd clearly ridden hard from town. Tell me exactly what happened, he said. Taking the chair she offered, Galilee recounted the confrontation in detail, watching Mason's expression darken as she repeated Hardin's thinly veiled threats. He's getting desperate, Mason said when she finished. The droughts hit his southern pastures hard, but threatening you directly, that's escalating things significantly. He also suggested you had ulterior motives for selling to my father, that you're playing some long game to regain the ranch. Mason's jaw tightened. Hardin specializes in sowing discord, divide and conquer. Is there any truth to it? Galilee asked quietly. Did you specifically seek out my father as a buyer? Yes, Mason admitted, but not for the reasons Hardin implies. After Thomas died, I knew I needed to sell to someone with resources and determination, someone Hardin couldn't easily intimidate or outmaneuver legally. Your father fit that description. He spoke often about you, his capable daughter who would join him once he was established. So you knew about me before we met. I knew Jonathan Turner had a widowed daughter with a good education and strong opinions. I didn't know you'd be traveling alone after his death or that our paths would cross as they did. Mason leaned forward. Galilee, I never planned to reclaim this ranch. I kept a small piece of land because this territory is my home, despite everything that happened. Taking the sheriff's position was about justice for Thomas, not some scheme involving you or Silver Springs. The earnestness in his eyes convinced her more than his words. I believe you. Relief flickered across his face. Thank you. What do we do about Hardin? Mason considered. His threat was implicit rather than explicit, which limits my official options. But I can increase patrols in this area, and I'll have a direct conversation with him tomorrow about the consequences of threatening property owners. Will that be enough? Probably not, Mason admitted. Hardin's backed himself into a corner. His pride won't let him negotiate properly, and his financial situation is deteriorating. It makes him dangerous. What do you suggest? The walkers return tomorrow, Galilee nodded. By noon. Good. Until then, I'll stay here. When she started to protest, he raised a hand. Not in the house, I'll bunk with your hands, but on the property in case Hardin decides to return tonight. The relief she felt at his offer surprised her with its intensity. Thank you, Mason, he stood, replacing his hat. I'll check the perimeter before turning in, lock the doors behind me. Galilee watched from the window as he spoke with the ranch hands, their figures silhouetted against the bunkhouse lamplight. His presence brought a sense of security she hadn't realized she was missing. Despite the circumstances, she slept better that night than she had in weeks. Morning brought no signs of trouble. Mason joined Galilee for breakfast, his manner professional but warmer than it had been during their recent encounters. I'll speak with Hardin today, he said as they sat at the kitchen table. Make the legal boundaries clear. Be careful, Galilee urged. He seemed unstable yesterday. Mason nodded. I'll take deputies with me. They fell silent, the domesticity of sharing breakfast creating an intimacy neither seemed prepared to acknowledge. Finally, Mason cleared his throat. You've done well with the ranch. Better than I expected, if I'm honest. Galilee raised an eyebrow. Because I'm a woman, or an Easterner. Both, I suppose. Ranching's hard even for those who have grown up with it. I've had excellent teachers in the walkers and the work. I find I enjoy it more than I anticipated. She studied him over her coffee cup. Do you miss it? The ranch? Mason considered the question. Sometimes. Not the land itself so much as the purpose it provided, building something, seeing it grow. And being sheriff doesn't provide that, it's different. Necessary work, but reactive more than creative. His eyes met hers. But it's where I'm needed now. The simple statement carried weight that Galilee felt rather than understood. This man had endured loss and made difficult choices, guided by principles rather than expedients. The realization deepened her already growing admiration. I should go, Mason said, rising. The walkers will be back soon, and I need to find Hardin before he causes more trouble. At the door, he paused. Galilee, be vigilant. Hardin's unpredictable. I will. He seemed about to say more, then simply nodded and left. Galilee watched him ride away, aware of a complicated tangle of emotions she wasn't ready to examine too closely. The walkers returned as expected, alarmed by Galilee's account of Hardin's visit. Benjamin immediately organized increased patrols of the property boundaries, while Margaret fussed over Galilee like a mother hen. 2 days passed without incident. On the third morning, Billy Jenkins reported finding a section of fence cut along the southern boundary. Cattle tracks suggested some of Hardin's herd had been deliberately driven onto Silver Springs land overnight. "Testing us," Benjamin said grimly when Galilee relayed the news, "seeing how we'll respond." "And how will we?" she asked. "Fix the fence, drive any strays back to his property." "Document everything." Benjamin hesitated. "Might be good to let the sheriff know too." Galilee nodded, though she felt reluctant to call on Mason again so soon. She penned a brief note detailing the incident and sent it with the weekly supply wagon heading to Tucson. The response came the following day, not from Mason directly, but from his deputy, a serious young man named Frederick Powell. "Sheriff reads compliments, madam," Deputy Powell said, handing her a sealed envelope. "He would have come himself, but he's dealing with a situation in town." The letter inside was concise. Galilee Hardin denied any knowledge of the fence cutting when confronted. "Without witnesses, little I can do officially except document the incident. Deputy Powell will examine the fence line and take statements from your hands." Hardin was seen meeting with 3 known troublemakers yesterday at the Broken Spoke Saloon. "Exercise extreme caution. I've instructed Powell to remain at Silver Springs overnight if you'll permit it." Mason, the formality of the note disappointed her, though she recognized its professional necessity. She welcomed Deputy Powell's assistance, and his presence through the evening and overnight passed uneventfully. Another week went by. The tension with Hardin simmered but didn't boil over. Twice more sections of fence were cut, and once a small fire was started in a southern pasture, though ranch hands spotted it quickly and prevented serious damage. Each incident was documented and reported to Mason, who responded with brief notes and occasional visits by deputies. Galilee found herself growing increasingly frustrated by Mason's continued absence. Their last meaningful conversation had seemed to clear the air between them, yet he maintained his distance. When she mentioned this to Margaret, the older woman gave her a knowing look. "Man's torn, if you ask me," Margaret said as they preserved peaches in the kitchen. "Between duty and inclination." "What do you mean? He's the sheriff now. Investigating troubles at your ranch while harboring personal feelings could be seen as a conflict." Galilee nearly dropped the jar she was filling. "Personal feelings? What makes you think, oh child?" Margaret smiled kindly. "I've known Mason Reed for 5 years, never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Heat rose to Galilee's cheeks. "That's absurd. He barely knows me." "Sometimes knowing takes but a moment. Understanding, now that's what takes time." Margaret sealed another jar. "Besides, he's been asking Benjamin about you regular as clockwork, how you're managing, if you're happy here, whether you might be thinking of returning east eventually." The revelation left Galilee momentarily speechless. Had she misinterpreted Mason's professional distance as disinterest? The possibility stirred something warm in her chest, something she'd thought long buried with James. Before she could pursue the conversation further, Benjamin burst into the kitchen, his face grim. "Riders coming from the south," he announced. "Hardin and at least 8 men, armed." Galilee's heart raced. "Get the hands and the rifles." Events unfolded with alarming speed. By the time Galilee reached the porch, Hardin and his men were approaching the yard. Benjamin and 4 ranch hands formed a line before the house, rifles ready but not yet raised. "Stay inside, Mrs. Turner," Benjamin urged. "No." Galilee stepped forward, positioning herself slightly behind Benjamin but clearly visible. "This is my property. I'll face him directly." Hardin reined his horse to a stop, his men spreading out behind him in an intimidating line. His face was flushed with what might have been anger or whiskey. "Turner," he shouted, "got a bone to pick with you." Benjamin stepped forward. "State your business, Hardin. Mrs. Turner is listening." "Found 3 of my best breeding bulls dead this morning," Hardin snarled. "Poisoned at the water hole on the boundary line. You're doing." Galilee moved up beside Benjamin. That's a false accusation, Mr. Harden. My people have been nowhere near your water holes. Someone put loco weed in the water. My foreman tracked signs back to your property. Impossible, Benjamin stated flatly. We've been vigilant about our boundaries since your last visit. Calling me a liar, old man. Harden's hand moved toward his holster. Step back from your weapon, Harden, came a commanding voice from the side of the yard. All heads turned to see Mason Reed riding in, flanked by 2 deputies. He dismounted smoothly, his badge catching the sunlight as he approached. Sheriff, Harden acknowledged with barely concealed contempt. Come to protect your lady friend. Come to prevent you from making a serious mistake, Mason replied evenly. Threatening a property owner with armed men is against the law. So is poisoning a man's cattle. If your cattle were poisoned, file a formal complaint. I'll investigate. Mason's voice remained calm but carried unmistakable authority. Right now, you and your men are trespassing on Mrs. Turner's land with weapons drawn. I suggest you leave immediately. Harden's face contorted with rage. You've been against me from the start, Reed. You and this Eastern witch conspiring to ruin me. That's enough, Mason warned, his hand resting casually near his holster. Ride out now, Harden. While you still can. For a terrible moment, Galilee thought Harden might order his men to attack. The tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Then abruptly Harden spat on the ground. This ain't over, he growled. Not by a long shot. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men following after a moment's hesitation. Only when they were well out of sight did Galilee release the breath she'd been holding. Mason approached, his expression concerned. Are you all right? Yes, she managed, though her hands trembled slightly. Thank you for arriving when you did. Powell was checking your southern boundary as requested, saw Harden and his men heading this way and rode for me immediately. Mason turned to Benjamin. Double the guards tonight. I'll leave Powell and Jackson here as additional support. Benjamin nodded, already organizing the men. Mason guided Galilee gently toward the porch, away from the others. Harden's growing desperate. The poisoned cattle's story is almost certainly fabrication, a pretext for confrontation. What does he hope to gain? To frighten you into selling, or at least granting him water rights? Or perhaps to provoke an incident that would give him an excuse for more direct action? Mason's jaw tightened. I've sent for the territorial marshal. This goes beyond local disputes now. Will the marshal help? If there's evidence of Harden's involvement in the fence cutting and fire setting, yes. Marshal Parker is a fair man, not influenced by local connections. Mason hesitated. Galilee, have you considered? That is, would you be safer returning east until this is resolved? The suggestion struck her like a physical blow. Absolutely not. This is my home now, Mason. I won't be driven from it by threats. Something flickered in his eyes, pride, perhaps, or admiration. I thought you might say that, just had to ask. They stood close on the porch, the danger of the moment creating an intimacy that transcended their recent distance. Galilee was acutely aware of his presence, the strength in his tall frame, the determination in his eyes, the faint scent of leather and soap that accompanied him. Mason, she began, uncertain what she meant to say but feeling the need to say something. He met her gaze, and for a moment the world around them seemed to fade. Galilee, Sheriff, Deputy Powell called from across the yard. Rider coming fast from the east, the moment shattered. Mason turned, hand moving to his weapon, then relaxed as he recognized the approaching rider. It's Williams from town, he said. Something must have happened. The young man reined his lathered horse to a stop before them, his face streaked with dust and sweat. Sheriff, he gasped. Fire in town. The jail and courthouse, someone set them ablaze. Deputy Morris is hurt bad. Mason's expression hardened. Harden, can't prove it, sir, but 3 of his known associates were seen riding away just as the fire started. Mason turned to Galilee, conflict evident in his face. I have to go. Of course you do, she said, understanding immediately. We'll be all right here with your deputies. He hesitated, then reached for her hand, pressing it briefly. This ends soon, I promise you. Before she could respond, he was striding toward his horse, issuing orders to his deputies to remain at Silver Springs. Within moments, he and Williams were galloping toward Tucson. leaving Galilee with the unsettling feeling that events were accelerating towards some inevitable confrontation. The night passed without incident, though few at Silver Springs slept soundly. By morning, word arrived that the courthouse fire had been contained with minimal damage, but Deputy Morris remained in serious condition from a blow to the head. No direct evidence linked Hardin to either the fire or the attack, but suspicion ran strong. The territorial marshal, James Parker, arrived the following day, a tall, lean man with steel-gray hair and a reputation for implacable justice. He spent hours interviewing Galilee, Benjamin, and the ranch hands, examining the cut fences and burned pasture, and reviewing the documentation of each incident. "Mrs. Turner," he said as they concluded in her sitting room, "your situation is concerning but not unique. Land and water disputes are common in the territories." "Is that all this is?" Galilee asked. "A dispute over water rights." Marshal Parker's weathered face showed a hint of admiration. "You're perceptive. No, this has become personal for Hardin, a matter of pride and vengeance as much as resources." "Makes him unpredictable. And dangerous," Galilee added. "Indeed, I'll be speaking with Hardin directly tomorrow. Sheriff Reed will accompany me." "Will that be enough to stop him?" The marshal considered her question. "Sometimes a show of federal authority is sufficient, sometimes not. Either way, we'll establish clear boundaries and consequences." After the marshal departed, Galilee found herself restless and uneasy. The ranch continued its daily operations. Cattle needed tending, repairs needed making, but an air of watchfulness pervaded everything. Mason's deputies remained, vigilant but increasingly concerned about the situation in town, with both the sheriff and marshal away. Late afternoon brought unexpected visitors: Margaret's daughter Emily and her husband John from Tucson, arriving in a wagon with their young son. "Mother insisted we come," Emily explained as she embraced Galilee. "Said you could use friendly faces and extra hands with everything happening." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Galilee deeply. Emily, a vivacious young woman who clearly took after her mother, bustled about helping with dinner preparations, while John joined Benjamin checking the property boundaries. Their 5-year-old son Tommy brought welcome laughter to the house, his innocent exuberance a reminder of life beyond immediate concerns. After dinner, as they sat on the porch enjoying the cooler evening air, Emily mentioned seeing Mason in town. "He looked exhausted," she said. "John said he's barely slept since the fire, trying to gather evidence against Hardin." "Has he found any?" Galilee asked, trying to sound merely interested rather than anxious. Emily exchanged glances with her husband. "John, you spoke with him more recently." John nodded, a serious young man with thoughtful eyes. Marshal Parker issued an order for Hardin to appear for questioning tomorrow morning. Sheriff Reed was concerned Hardin might flee instead. "Or worse," Benjamin muttered. A troubled silence fell over the group. Little Tommy, oblivious to the tension, chased fireflies in the yard until Margaret called him in for bed. As darkness deepened, Galilee found her thoughts continually returning to Mason, wondering where he was, whether he was safe, when she might see him again. The attack came near midnight. Galilee was awakened by shouting and the crack of gunfire. Throwing on a robe, she grabbed her rifle and rushed downstairs to find Benjamin already at the window, peering into the darkness. "Riders," he said tersely. "At least a dozen, firing at the bunkhouse." John appeared from the guest room, buckling on a gun belt. "Hardin has to be," Benjamin replied. "Deputies are returning fire from the bunkhouse, but they're outnumbered." More shots rang out, followed by a woman's scream from upstairs. Emily, frightened for her son. Galilee made a quick decision. "Get Margaret, Emily, and Tommy to the root cellar," she ordered. "It's the safest place if they start firing at the house." Benjamin nodded approval. "John and I will try to reach the bunkhouse. We need to consolidate our defense." "I'm coming with you," Galilee stated, checking her rifle. "Mrs. Turner," Benjamin began to protest. "This is my ranch, my responsibility. I won't hide while others fight for me." The older man studied her face, then nodded reluctantly. "Stay low and follow my lead." They slipped out the back door into the darkness. Gunfire continued sporadically from the direction of the bunkhouse, illuminating the night in brief, terrifying flashes. Keeping to the shadows, they worked their way toward the structure, the smell of gunpowder and dust heavy in the air. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night hoofbeats approaching fast from the east, accompanied by shouts and the distinctive crack of a rifle that seemed to echo with authority. "The marshal," John breathed, "and Sheriff Reed." Galilee's heart leapt. Through the darkness, she could make out riders approaching not just 2 men, but what appeared to be a dozen or more. The marshal had brought reinforcements. Hardin's men, caught by surprise, began to scatter. Some returned fire while others fled toward the southern boundary. In the confusion, 3 riders broke away from the main group and headed directly for the ranch house. "They're going for the house," Benjamin shouted. "Galilee, get back inside," but it was too late. The riders were between them and the house, moving fast. Galilee raised her rifle, prepared to defend herself, when a familiar voice called her name. "Galilee," Mason appeared through the darkness, his horse at full gallop. He reined in beside her, extending his hand. Quick, without hesitation, she grasped his arm and swung up behind him on the horse. Mason wheeled the animal around, heading toward the house as gunfire erupted behind them. Galilee clung to his waist, heart pounding as bullets whizzed past. They reached the porch just as 3 of Hardin's men burst from the shadows on foot, having dismounted nearby. Mason drew his revolver, firing twice and dropping one attacker. The other 2 scattered for cover. "Inside," he ordered, helping Galilee dismount. Now, they barely made it through the door when more shots splintered the wood around them. Mason slammed the door shut, pushing a heavy sideboard against it. "Margaret and the others?" he asked urgently. "Root cellar," Galilee replied, trying to steady her breathing. Benjamin and John were headed to the bunkhouse. Mason nodded, quickly checking the windows. "Marshal Parker arrived with a posse just as we got word of the attack. He's dealing with the main group, but these 3 broke away. A crash from the kitchen interrupted him, someone breaking in through the back door." Mason pushed Galilee behind him as they moved toward the sound, his revolver ready. A figure appeared in the kitchen doorway, Silas Hardin himself, wild-eyed and disheveled, a shotgun in his hands. "Reed," he snarled. "Should have known you'd be here protecting your woman." "It's over, Hardin," Mason said evenly. "Marshal Parker has most of your men in custody already. Put down the shotgun." "Nothing's over," Hardin replied, his voice slurred with what might have been whiskey or desperation. "Not while she still has my water. Not while you're still breathing." He raised the shotgun. Mason fired first, his shot striking Hardin's shoulder and spinning him sideways. The shotgun discharged into the ceiling, showering them with plaster dust. Hardin crashed into the kitchen table but remained standing, fumbling for a revolver at his belt. "Don't," Mason warned, his voice deadly calm. Hardin looked up, hatred burning in his eyes. "She ruined everything," he spat. "You both did." His hand closed around the revolver. Mason fired again, a clean shot that took Hardin in the chest. He crumpled to the floor, the unfired weapon clattering beside him. The sudden silence seemed deafening. Mason moved cautiously forward, kicking the revolver away before checking Hardin's pulse. "He's dead," he said quietly. Galilee sagged against the doorframe, the reality of what had happened washing over her in waves. Outside, the gunfire had ceased, replaced by shouted orders and the sounds of men being rounded up. Mason returned to her side, his face etched with concern. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to find words immediately. Mason holstered his weapon and gently drew her into his arms. Galilee went willingly, burying her face against his chest as delayed reaction set in. His heartbeat was strong and rapid beneath her cheek, his arms secure around her. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe now." They stood together in the dust-filled kitchen, holding each other as voices approached from outside. Only when Marshal Parker called Mason's name did they reluctantly separate. The aftermath unfolded with exhausting thoroughness. 3 of Hardin's men had been killed in the firefight, 2 wounded, and 7 captured. 1 ranch hand suffered a minor wound, and Deputy Powell had been grazed by a bullet but would recover. The marshal took statements from everyone, documenting the attack and Hardin's death with meticulous detail. Dawn was breaking by the time the last of the posse departed with their prisoners. Mason remained, having sent word to Tucson that he would return later. He found Galilee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky with gold and crimson. "You should rest," he said gently, coming to stand beside her. "It's been a long night." Galilee shook her head. "Too much happened. I don't think I could sleep yet." Mason nodded, understanding. They stood in companionable silence for a while, the morning birds beginning their chorus around them. "What happens now?" Galilee asked eventually. "With Hardin gone, his ranch will likely be sold to settle debts. The marshal mentioned several smaller ranchers might band together to purchase it and divide the land more equitably." Mason glanced at her. "Your water rights remain secure regardless." "That's not what I meant," she said softly. Mason turned to face her fully, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "What did you mean, Galilee? What happens with us?" "Now that the danger is past and you don't need to protect me anymore," something flickered in his eyes, surprise, then warmth. "Is that what you think this has been about? Protection? Hasn't it?" Mason shook his head slowly. "It started that way, perhaps. A sense of responsibility toward Jonathan Turner's daughter, but it became more, much more." The simple admission made Galilee's heart race. "When? I think I knew the moment I found you standing up to those men on the road to Tucson, so brave, so determined." His voice softened. "But I fought against it. You deserved honesty, not complications, and after my deception about the ranch. You thought I couldn't forgive that, could you?" he asked, vulnerability clear in his voice. Galilee considered the question, the events that had brought them to this moment. "I already have. Understanding your reasons helped, seeing the kind of man you truly are." She met his gaze directly. "That helped more." Mason stepped closer, hesitantly reaching for her hand. "I have nothing to offer you except myself, Galilee. The sheriff's job doesn't pay much, and my cabin is nothing compared to this ranch. Do you think I care about that?" she asked, linking her fingers with his. "After everything that's happened, what do you care about?" The question hung between them, simple yet profound. Galilee took a deep breath, finding courage to speak the truth she'd been avoiding. "I care about the man who came to my aid when I needed him, who respected my independence even while offering his protection, who's honorable and kind and stronger than he knows." She squeezed his hand. "I care about you, Mason Reed." The admission seemed to transform him. The caution in his expression gave way to something brighter, more hopeful. "I never expected to find someone like you," he said softly. "After Thomas died, I thought my life would be about justice and duty, nothing more. And now I find myself dreaming of possibilities I'd given up on." His free hand rose to gently touch her cheek. "I love you, Galilee Turner. I think I have almost from the beginning." The words washed over her like sunlight after a long winter. "I love you too," she whispered, the truth of it settling in her heart with perfect clarity. Mason drew her closer, his eyes seeking permission. When she nodded, he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that began gently but deepened with shared emotion. Galilee wound her arms around his neck, letting herself be swept away by feelings she'd thought lost to her forever. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "What happens now?" he asked, echoing her earlier question. Galilee smiled. "I have a ranch that needs running. You have a town that needs protecting. Perhaps we could figure out how those two facts might coexist." "Are you proposing an arrangement, Mrs. Turner?" Mason asked, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "I'm proposing we take time to discover what's possible between us," she replied. "Without threats or deceptions or misunderstandings. I'd like that very much." They sealed the agreement with another kiss, as the sun rose fully over Silver Springs Ranch, illuminating a landscape that had seen violence and sorrow, but now held promise of a different future. In the months that followed, Galilee and Mason courted properly, their relationship deepening through shared experiences and honest conversation. Mason continued as sheriff while helping at the ranch when time allowed. Galilee thrived as a rancher, earning respect throughout the territory for her determination and business acumen. They married the following spring in the small Tucson church, surrounded by friends who had become family. Benjamin gave the bride away, Margaret wept joyfully, and Emily's son Tommy served as ring bearer with solemn importance. Mason built an addition to the ranch house, a spacious office where he could conduct sheriff's business when not in town. Galilee surprised him by learning woodworking, crafting a writing desk that became his prized possession. 2 years after their wedding, their daughter Grace was born, followed 18 months later by their son Thomas, named for the uncle he would never meet but whose memory lived on in family stories. On warm evenings, Mason and Galilee often sat together on the porch, watching their children play in the yard where once there had been gunfire and danger. The land that had known so much strife now witnessed laughter and growth, the fulfillment of dreams that had seemed impossible in darker times. "Do you ever think about how we met?" Galilee asked one such evening, her head resting against Mason's shoulder. "Often," he admitted with a smile, "though I suspect our children will tire of hearing the story when they're older. I doubt that." It's quite a tale, a woman surrounded by threatening men, a mysterious cowboy riding to her rescue. Mason chuckled. "As I recall, you were doing a fair job of rescuing yourself. I don't owe you anything," you said, fierce as a mountain lion. "I was terrified," Galilee confessed, "but determined not to show it." "That's what courage is," Mason said, echoing words from long ago. "Doing what needs doing, even when it's hard." Galilee looked out over their ranch, the cattle grazing peacefully, the creek flowing strong and clear, the land thriving under their care. So much had changed since that dusty confrontation on the road to Tucson. She had changed, growing into her strength and purpose. "I'm glad you found me that day," she said softly. Mason pressed a kiss to her temple. "Providence," he murmured. "It led me to exactly where I needed to be." As twilight deepened around Silver Springs Ranch, Galilee Turner Reed knew with absolute certainty that she too was exactly where she needed to be in this place, in this life, with this man who had found her when she most needed finding, and who had helped her discover the true meaning of home.